Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are at in the world. We have people all over the world joining us today for our webinar entitled Best Practices for Survey Research. And we have our guest, Matt Hilburn, with us. Great guy, you'll get to know him. And we're excited to have him. He's a freelance researcher and someone who he and I become friends. He's a great guy. So we're also joined today by Dan Yardley. He's just going to also help out with some of the questions and participate here in there. Dan is a research consultant here at Sawtooth. So just a few details about the webinar, housekeeping here. We are here in Zoom. We would prefer that you use the Q&A section at the bottom of Zoom to ask questions. Don't use the chat button, so use the Q&A button. You can ask questions throughout the webinar, but the majority of them we'll get to at the end. We'll have a Q&A section, 10 to 15 minutes at the end, where you can ask questions. We always get asked this, but we always record the webinars and we send them out a few days later to everyone who registered. Just a few upcoming events that we're going to have here at Sawtooth Software we're excited about. November 4th through 6th, there's a virtual workshop entitled Essential Tools for Determining Preference with Choice-Based Conjoint. On November 14th, we will have another one of these webinars, Skew-Based Conjoint, a Practitioner's Guide. January 22nd through 24th, there'll be an in-person workshop out in Orlando entitled Optimizing Features and Pricing Using Survey Research. And then we're really excited for next May, May 6th through 9th. We'll have our Sawtooth Research Conference out in New Orleans. Please put that on your on your calendars for next year. It's always a very amazing event. You'll love it. So see if you can get budget and permission to get out there in May. All this information can be found on our website, sawtoothsoftware.com/resources/events. Well, I'm excited to introduce Matt. Today we have Matt Hilburn. He is a freelance marketing research statistician with 15 years of experience in marketing research. He has a master's of statistics in econometrics and a bachelor of science in economics and business. He has a passion for translating technical findings into everyday language for informed decision-making. He has instructed at the University of Utah Business School. I went to the University of Utah, so that's cool. And he's developed many data analytics courses and certificates. So welcome, Matt. How's it going?
It's going well, Justin. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, we're excited. So Matt's going to take it away and share his screen. I will turn off my video and take it away, Matt.
All right, wonderful. Thanks, Justin. Really good to be with all of you and super excited to be with Sawtooth Software and appreciate all the webinars that Sawtooth Software puts on. And as we discussed what to talk about for today's webinar, I thought, we do so much with conjoint and max diff, and maybe for those of you out there who are either getting into research for the first time, or for those of you who've been writing surveys for decades and would like a refresher and to just sort of see this again, I thought this would be a good topic to cover. So super excited to have you all here and to get any questions that you've got at the end as well. So a really quick outline, there's so much to talk about with regard to survey design, survey methodology, questionnaire writing. This isn't going to be covering everything because we only have such a limited amount of time, but we'll certainly cover some key things. And in particular, we'll do a quick overview. We'll talk through defining the problem. So the problem that we're trying to solve with a survey, developing an approach to solving that problem. We'll look at hierarchical structure of questions that we should be implementing in surveys, basic survey flow, general survey guidelines. We'll talk through how to write questions right and then making sure that we're aligning our surveys with objectives, and then we'll talk through some quality assurance issues as well. Most of this presentation is going to actually follow the chronology of writing a survey. So we'll kind of walk you through how to write a survey from start to finish. It's not going to be perfectly in order in that way, but most of it will. So we already talked about who I am. Skip over that. You've all seen the webinar overview. This is just for reference, so we'll kind of move on through that and jump right in. So first off, most of you are probably familiar with the 7-step marketing research process. Depending on the author, sometimes it's not 7 steps, sometimes it's a little different. But for this presentation, we're going to focus on the first 3 steps of the market research process, which is that defining the problem and developing an approach to the problem. And we'll just kind of touch on those a little bit because we really do need to talk about those before we can talk about physically writing a survey. But then the majority of this discussion will focus on designing and preparing the research instrument. So let's start with defining the problem. What does this mean? So you either work at a company and you're responsible for writing a survey, or perhaps you have a client who's asking you to write a survey, whatever that may be. Before we ever even think about writing any questions, jumping into a survey, we have to really fully identify what the problem is. And this is a really missed step, a really commonly skipped step. And, a lot of times when I watch webinars or trainings or see courses, sometimes there's a lot of fluff in courses, and, you think, oh, maybe this isn't applicable to me. This is just for academic purposes. No, this is really important. We need to make sure that we're doing this. And so we conduct a problem audit. This might be really simple. Perhaps the problem is really simple. We know the problem and it's not that difficult to define. And so maybe this isn't very in-depth, and that's okay. In other cases, if the problem is a little less defined, maybe the client or our boss or our customer, or whoever it is we're conducting this research for, is not fully aware of what the problem is and how we should approach it. We might need to conduct a couple of in-depth interviews with key stakeholders or decision makers. These could be really formal or they could be really informal. Perhaps some focus groups where we pull a few people into a room together and talk through the issue. Maybe we need to talk to some industry experts if there's a particular topic we're worried about that's a little bit outside of our expertise. Understanding the history behind the problem and any culture surrounding the problem. And then we never want to ignore the fact that sometimes there's already research that exists on these sorts of problems. And so if there's any secondary data that exists, we should be investigating that as well. Once we've sort of understood all of that, we have to define the problem, and we do this through building objectives. And again, I know most of you are probably corporate researchers where you either do this full-time as a job, or you're the only person around in your team who maybe has any experience with this, and so you're the one who's been asked to write a survey. Maybe you've never written a survey before, and so this is your chance to try and start doing that. We need to come up with some objectives, and it's often the case that as the researcher, it's our job to help the in-person, whether that's our boss or the stakeholder. We need to help them define this. So we probably are the ones who are going to write the business objective. And so before we kind of get into writing these objectives, we ask ourselves why we're doing all of this. And there's an approach called the 5 whys. Maybe it's not 5, maybe it's 4, maybe it's 7, where we hear a problem. So to use a non-research example, my car won't start. Okay, why won't it start? Well, the battery's dead. Why is the battery dead? Well, the alternator's not working. Why isn't the alternator working? It's because the belt was worn out and I didn't replace it. Okay, why didn't you replace it? Well, I just didn't maintain my car as well as I should have. So the issue that we're facing, which is that the vehicle won't start, that's not really the problem. The problem is that we don't have a good cadence for conducting car maintenance. And so this is the kind of experiment that we need to have as we're talking through research objectives. So to use a research example, I'm often asked by clients, so they'll say, hey, we want to conduct a brand perception study. Well, when they say that to me, it kind of sounds to me like they've already come up with the solution to the problem rather than giving me the problem. And sometimes I like to work through with them, well, what is the actual problem you're trying to solve? And they'll say, well, we want to conduct this survey because we want to better understand our customers. Why do you want to do that? Well, we want to see how we can better track Gen Z. Why? Because sales with Gen Z are low. Okay, why are sales with Gen Z low? We don't know. Okay, so the real issue here is that we want to understand why they're not attracting Gen Z. And maybe that is a brand perception study. Maybe it's something else. Maybe it's a conjoint study or a max diff. The point is, by understanding that objective really well, it may actually completely change the research design and the methodology for how we'll actually approach this problem. And so we want to be sure that we're kind of pushing whoever is asking us to write a survey to really get down to what the core issue is that we're looking at. Now, once we've kind of figured that out, now we want to figure out, all right, how do we collect the data that's going to answer these problems? An online survey isn't always the right way to do that, though it's certainly one of the most excellent ways to collect primary data. We may also need secondary data. And so we need to explore through that problem what the approach to this is going to be. And the best way I've found to do that is to write what's called a research plan. This is a really simple document. You document the background of the project, what the issue is, why we're conducting this research, what the objectives are, and the approach that you've developed to solving this problem, full plan, any relevant information. You really want to have everything documented. This is not a difficult thing to write. It's probably 2 pages. And by having it, you'll find that you can reference it over and over again as you conduct this research project. It's also not uncommon that if you conduct a research project and there's a lot of stakeholders or a lot of people interested in this study, that they may at some point say, hey, how come we didn't do this? Or why didn't we introduce this into the survey? By having a documented research plan that has been approved by all the stakeholders at the table, you can always reference back to that research plan and say, well, that wasn't in the research plan. The research plan is the document that guides the entire research project. So we need to be really clear that that's in place. Now, I'll point out that almost all statistical analysis is based on the assumption that data is coming from a random sample. But surveys are not random samples. They're a form of what's called convenience sampling. So part of this research plan needs to have what we call a sample plan or a sample frame that talks about who's going to be taking the survey, where are we going to get the sample from, what's going to be the sample size. We need to make sure that that sample plan, this presentation is on survey writing, so I won't go deep into a sample plan, but if you're going to collect data, you need to make sure you've got a really good, robust sample plan so that your data is going to be something we can call statistically significant, large enough sample sizes, representative, etc. Okay, so we've figured out what the problem is, and we've written a research plan. We've defined probably a business objective by now, or a few business objectives. From there, how do we start writing a survey? Step one for a lot of people in writing a survey is writing survey questions. That's almost the last step. The first step is everything we've already discussed and building these objectives. Now, I've got business objectives here and I've got research objectives. The only reason I've got those separated is a business objective is usually an issue that a client is facing or the business is facing, such as the objective might be, how do we attract Gen Z audiences? Well, the research objective might be something more like identifying what Gen Z audiences want, right? So we kind of convert a business objective into a research objective, something that we can research. This distinction may or may not end up being applicably relevant to you. You can do it that way. I have kind of gotten over the years to where I just create objectives and then survey questions, and I kind of cut out this middle part, but it's not a bad step to be that thorough. So we create these business objectives. We can convert them into research objectives, and then we convert those into survey questions, keeping in mind that for any given survey, you're probably looking at 3 to 5 objectives per survey. If you get too many objectives, well, we're going to need, say, 3 to 5 questions per objective, then our survey is going to get too long. And so we want to keep our surveys focused. Now, this is a little less applicable with choice-based surveys because usually with choice-based surveys, we have a really clearly defined objective, product optimization or brand equity or whatever it may be, and it might just be one objective. But but something to keep in mind. What does this look like? So we've got our objective up here, and I've made just sort of a generic example here. Objective one is we want to identify brand awareness. So now that we have that objective is when we finally start even thinking about writing survey questions. And our exercise here is to say, what questions do we need in order to address that business objective? Well, to identify brand awareness, let's ask an unaided awareness question, which would be an open response. We say, when you think of widget companies, which ones come to mind? Then we might ask a second question that says, specifically, so this is an aided question, how aware are you of Acme Widget Company? And then this might have a scale. I've never heard of them, all the way down to I shop there regularly. And then we might say, okay, well, what if we get a little bit more detailed and we say, how aware of you are of the following products Acme Widget Company sells? And then we offer a few options there in a matrix table like this. So then we step back and we say, all right, so our objective was to identify brand awareness. We've asked 3 questions. Have we fully addressed this objective? And the answer is no. There are lots of questions we could ask about brand awareness. We could ask, where did you first hear about Acme Widget Company? What sorts of ads do you recall seeing from the company? Where did you see those ads? So there are so many things we could ask, but this is the structure we need to create so that we don't get any kind of scope creep. When we start by just writing survey questions first, it gets a little, I'd say it gets a little scattered, a little confusing. You just sort of end up with a lot of questions that you sort of feel like, I don't know, do we really need to ask that question? Or, maybe you ask questions that aren't actually related to brand awareness at all. And so when somebody says, when you finish the survey and someone looks it over and they say, hey, how come we didn't ask about, the reputation of the company? Then you might say, well, does that apply to any of the research objectives that we developed or not? And if the answer is yes, it does, then maybe you missed a question. And if the answer is no, then we say, okay, well, then that doesn't fit within this survey. We would either need to add a new business objective, or in many cases, again, your survey can be getting too long and you don't want to add too many objectives, which we'll get to that shortly as well, survey length. Okay, survey flow. So what should this generally look like? So we'll start really high level and then we'll get more detailed. So we start with an introduction. We need to tell respondents why we're asking them to take this survey. We need to give them an estimate of how long the survey will take. We need to tell them what the incentive will be if there's going to be an incentive. If you're using a sample provider or a panel company, you wouldn't mention anything about the incentive. But if you're sending this to, if you're sending this to customers of your own business that you work at, you might want to tell them what the incentive is going to be. By the way, I don't think I mentioned this anywhere else in the survey. You should offer an incentive. Do not ask someone to take a survey without incentivizing them for this reason. If you will get what's called non-response bias, where you'll only hear from people who love you, or you'll only hear from people who hate you, or you'll only hear from people who love taking surveys for one reason or another, but you won't hear from the 95% of the general population of people who receive that survey. So I really, really encourage you, if you ever send out a survey, include an incentive. If you don't include an incentive, I would not make any decisions based on that data because it will have non-response bias. Help them understand that the information that they provide is confidential, if it is confidential. Sometimes the survey you send out won't be confidential. Also understand the difference between confidential and anonymous. Sometimes we send out an anonymous survey, but sometimes it's not anonymous. Sometimes it's just confidential, which means that we know who they are. We have their name or their email address attached to their responses, but we're going to keep it confidential and we won't share that with anyone. And then we thank them for their time, of course. Okay, so then the next section after the introduction is we need to have a really robust screener section. This is another thing that I see people do either really poorly or miss altogether. And this is a really, really important part of your survey. So this is the place where we make sure we're getting the right people to take our survey. And again, if you're sending this survey through a panel company, then you've already done some work to predefine who the audience is. The survey is only going to that predefined audience, or perhaps it's all of your customer base. And in that case, hopefully, everybody's getting the survey that's supposed to be getting it. However, even if you've done all of those checks, it's still a really good idea to include some questions to make sure you're talking to the right person. Let's say you only want to talk to your customers in Utah and you've got customers nationwide. So you want to include a question that asks what state you live in. Now, we don't want to be distrusting of people, but there are also bots online and that get a hold of a survey that can take a survey. And so we want to create questions that aren't going to be obvious what the answer is. So we wouldn't want to say, do you live in Utah? Yes or no? Because then a respondent might say, okay, they want me to say yes, I'm going to click yes so I can take this survey and maybe get the incentive they're offering. So instead, we would just ask, what state do you live in? And if they say anything other than Utah, they get terminated from the survey. So we want to have up to say somewhere between 1 to 5 questions usually is enough to make sure we're talking to the right person. Are you a decision maker with regard to whatever the topic we're talking about? What state do you live in? Let's say we're conducting a study only of a particular demographic. Let's say it's Gen Z. We want to ask a question of what's your age range, and those sorts of things. Some surveys have a tendency to have too many screener questions. We're probably not going to incentivize somebody who gets kicked out of the survey for failing the screener. So don't make them answer 20 questions only to find out that they don't qualify and then they get kicked out. Keep it as short as possible. Okay, so then we'll get into the survey body, which we'll talk about in a second, and then we'll close the survey. At the close, you ask for their information for their incentive, like an email, if you're sending this to customers, but if it's through a panel, you wouldn't need to do that at all. When we write the objectives and we write the survey questions under each of the objectives, we'll sort of have them in an order probably. When we write the survey, we don't simply delete the objectives and then we're left with the order of the survey questions. It does often make sense that the questions are going to be, clustered together with like themes, but we need to address the flow of the survey to make sure that the questions fit, and that they make sense, and that it makes for a good experience for the respondent. So we think in terms of this funnel approach where you start really broad. So you might introduce certain topics. You might ask about awareness of a company, awareness of a product, awareness of the topic you're about to discuss. Then you get up to the more general questions like, well, what's your overall satisfaction? How likely are you to recommend our company? Really, really broad questions. Then we get into more specific things like, experiences that they've had, really detailed product feedback. So broad to specific, and also keeping sensitive questions at the end of the survey if there are any sensitive questions. Demographics don't tend to be very sensitive, but those we would tend to put at the end of the survey, or questions that have sort of a socially desirable answer, we would usually put at the end of a survey. Keeping in mind that some of these questions might actually need to go at the front of the survey in the screener section. So again, if we're targeting Gen Z, then we're going to need to ask about age at the beginning of the survey, not at the end. Okay. Some other general survey guidelines. Survey length. Don't worry about question count, really. When you're developing the survey, I find it to be best to include every question you think would make sense for this survey. And don't restrict yourself by saying, oh, I think we're getting too many questions in here. Just write all the questions out. We can always delete questions. But if we miss a question because we just feel like the survey is getting too long, number one, we don't want that to just be our decision. We might want others to have a say in that. But number two, I just find it better to cut at the end. But as far as survey length, we want it to be as short as possible. And I do find that this is an issue in the industry where people write really long surveys. People like me and maybe like you, we like taking surveys because we're research nerds and it's just the cool thing that research nerds do. But a typical person does not love taking surveys. That's the sad thing to admit. So we need to make it as engaging as possible and as interesting as possible, but people generally don't like taking long surveys. We should be targeting 7 minutes for a survey, maybe 10 minutes max. This is a little bit easier to get away with if we're talking about a choice-based survey, because choice-based surveys are a little more interesting to take versus a traditional survey. So we can kind of get away with it being a little longer, but we still need to be cautious of that. I had one client years ago who, in their RFP, they dictated that the survey needed to be 20 minutes long. which is an interesting thing to dictate, because the only thing that we should be dictating is perhaps what the objectives are or what we want to learn. The length of the survey is really irrelevant to any of that. Other than making sure we keep it as short as possible. Now, if you're providing a larger incentive, you can also usually get away with a longer survey, so that's something that you can consider. Conjoint and max diff studies, also be careful to not have too many additional objectives. If you have a conjoint exercise and you're showing 10 or 20 screens, we want to be cautious to not ask a whole lot of additional questions outside of that conjoint exercise. You can ask some, but again, it can just make the survey too long. And even within, say, conjoints, mathematically, the longer a conjoint exercise is, or a max diff exercise is, the better. From a mathematical standpoint. But keep in mind that the experience might go down as people are taking that survey. So even if it works mathematically, don't ignore the actual survey experience that people are going to go through. Okay, so once the survey is programmed, you're going to want to time it. If it's too long, think about cutting some questions. If it's too short, you're also not going to be getting enough value out of it. If you time a survey and it takes 4 or 5 minutes, you don't want to waste the time, energy, and money to send out that survey. Now, you don't want to throw in any unnecessary questions, and so if it's short, then it's short. But just keep in mind that if there's extra room, you might want to keep in mind putting some extra questions in there. Okay, open-ended questions. This is a big pet peeve of mine. Surveys are not really for open-ended questions. Surveys are for closed-ended questions. If you find that you have a lot of open-ended questions you need to ask, you might need to start with qualitative research. Hold some in-depth interviews with customers or stakeholders, whoever the target audience is. You might need to hold some focus groups. The purpose of qualitative research is that it's exploratory research. We're exploring the topic and we're creating response options from their feedback that will go into the online survey. So just keep that in mind. People don't like typing when they're taking a survey. So you want to keep those to a minimum. I do encourage that you put at least one open-ended question in the survey because it's a great data quality check. If there's gibberish in an open-ended response, that can be a red flag for data quality. If it's a really great answer and well articulated, then you know that it's good quality. So definitely include at least one. But I try to think in terms of 3 or so as being the max. I have gone over that, but try to keep it short if possible. Also, are you going to do anything with all of those responses? Hopefully you will. But if you send a survey to 1,000 people and you've asked 10 open-ended responses, that's a lot of information to read. And I don't encourage using AI as your sole way of evaluating open-ended questions. It can be a great approach to identify themes, but ideally you're reading those questions and you're using quotes from it and gaining real insight from it. So just keep that in mind. Would you really use all of that information? And if so, then maybe that's a good approach. Okay, number of survey questions. I get this question a lot as well. How many questions should be in a survey? Well, it's kind of irrelevant. It's not really how many survey questions you have. It's really more about the length of the survey. How long does it take to complete the survey? To get a 7-minute survey, what is that? Maybe 20 questions or so, depending on the type of question. If it's a matrix question with a lot of options, then that's going to take a long time. If it's an open-ended question, that's going to take a long time. If it's a really fast, easy question with only 2 options, that'll be shorter. So the number of questions is not so relevant. It's more about how long it takes to complete the survey. We want to randomize all nominal data. If you don't know what nominal is, we're going to talk about that in a second, but it's basically a descriptor. So if you have a question that says, what's your favorite hobby? The results are going to be, I like skiing or mountain biking or going to the theater. That's nominal data. It doesn't have a number in it in any way. Those sorts of questions should usually be randomized. And that helps us prevent some primacy and recency bias, which we'll talk about in a second as well. The only reason you wouldn't randomize nominal data is if there's a good reason for the order. Like if you ask what state do you live in and you randomize 50 states, that's going to be a nightmare for people to find their state. So those should be in order so that people can find what they're looking for. You also want to randomize all questions that might make sense. So, for example, if you're asking people about a certain tagline or message, and you have 3 questions for each tagline. How well do you like this tagline? What's your favorite thing about it? Whatever it may be. You might want to randomize those taglines so that people are receiving the taglines in different orders to prevent any bias. You want to force response to all questions. The only exception might be if you have an open-ended question that's maybe not a critical open-ended question. You could have them give the ability to skip that. But unless you really like dealing with data imputation issues and cleaning up missing data, I always force response. We're sending this survey to them. I expect them to answer the questions. If they don't want to answer the questions, that's okay. They would just not be able to move forward with the survey. Okay, a couple of quick issues that are sometimes forgotten. Make sure that your lists have the right answer. I just took a survey yesterday that did not have all of the options. In particular, it did not have a none option. So it asked me a question and it gave me a few options and it said, which of these apply to you? None of them applied to me, but there was no none option. So make sure that your lists are mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive. Make sure they've got all the right answers. But at the minimum, you've got to include a none option, maybe throw in an other option for somebody to click on so that they can move forward in the survey. And you should also build an analysis plan at this stage. So without getting too detailed into what an analysis plan is, this is going to be this is going to tell you by the time you get all the data back, what are you going to do with the data? Well, I'm going to create a model with this data, and I'm going to create some crosstabs with this data. You need to define all of that before you finish the survey so that you can make sure your survey is written in a way that you can actually conduct all of that analysis when you get to that point. Okay, a couple of really quick things about writing questions right. Double-barreled questions. This is a fun one. The classic example, do you feel like Coke is delicious and refreshing? That's 2 questions. Make sure you're only asking 1 question. So this needs to be separated into 2 questions. Leading questions. I find this really common in nonprofit research for some reason. And I think it's because anytime we're trying to get information about anything of importance, perhaps the people writing the survey have a little bit of passion regarding that topic, and questions can somehow reflect that passion. So leading would be, most students think virtual learning isn't working. Do you agree? You wouldn't want to say it that way. You would want this to be a very neutral question asking how they feel whether virtual learning is working or not. You see this a lot at retailers. We strive for 5-star ratings. Please rate our customer service. You don't want to tell them what the answer is before they start. That's leading. Or do you feel our advanced technology offers better results than competitor options? Don't tell them it's advanced. You just need to ask about the technology. Okay, acquiescence bias. This is more of an issue with focus groups and in-depth interviews than surveys, but this is the desire to be agreeable. And you might think that not a lot of people have that, but this is something that is an issue. People desire to just be agreeable and say yes. So we want to be sure that we're writing questions in a way that the answer isn't obvious that we're looking for. And again, sometimes it's actually difficult to just get an honest answer for a socially desirable answer. So being really careful how we write questions is important. Satisficing is often an issue. This is where respondents will just select any satisfactory answer. This is probably because they're quickly going through the survey. This is usually because the survey is too long. And at this point, they're just trying to get through it. So this is something we can minimize by making a really clean, easy, and short survey. And then primacy and recency bias. If you have a list of options and you say, hey, which of the below options is your favorite? And you've got a list of 10 items, there is a tendency for some people to either select the first option or as they read it down they might select the last option. One way to prevent the bias of that is by, again, randomizing those options so that every respondent sees a different version of that list, a different order of that list, and that can help with that. And then finally, don't educate or sell anything in a survey. That is not the time for either of those. It'll take up extra space in the survey, and it will bias your results. Try to make your questions really concise. Don't use any unnecessary language. I still see this a lot on a scale from not at all likely to very likely. You don't need to say that. You can just say, how likely are you to recommend our product? And they can see the scale. So it's a little thing, but it can save a little bit of cognitive load from the respondent by not having to read that. And the next question I always get when I show this is, well, how many scale points should we use? Should we use 3, 5, 7, 10, 100? And the answer to that is it depends on what analytics you want to conduct. If you want to use this as a dependent variable for a regression analysis, which some people may not love because this is not ratio level data, but you would probably want this to be at least 7 scale points. If you're really just trying to get a really quick, minimal, I just need a quick pulse on this, maybe you could do 3. They're either not likely, they're neutral, or they're likely. So it's all dependent on what you plan to do with the data, which is why you need to have your analysis plan before you finish your survey. Okay, try to mix it up with different kinds of questions, though your questions are likely going to be very important to be written in a certain way. So you hopefully can find some ways to mix it up. Visually, switch up the orientation and the presentation of the questions. If it's just a yes or no, maybe make it a horizontal yes or no rather than a vertical. These things may seem really simple, but again, we're really focused on data quality, and making the survey an easy and positive experience for a respondent can really go a long way. Make sure your multiple selects and single selects are programmed properly. I have taken surveys that say select all that apply, but it only lets you pick one. So make sure you're quality checking those sorts of things. And again, at the end of the day, always include an I don't know or a not applicable option if you need to, so that you can make sure that people have a response they can select. Okay, and make sure that your surveys are not necessarily grammatically correct. Okay, so you don't need to write a survey and send it to the copy editor. Surveys can actually be kind of confusing if they're written in a grammatically correct way. They should be written so that everyone can take the survey and no one's going to be confused by it. Being grammatically correct sometimes takes a little bit more space, whereas not being grammatically correct can sometimes be shorter. So we just need to write it so that it's easy to read and easy to understand. It's okay if there's a dangling participle in there. Just make sure it's easy. Don't use industry lingo unless your survey is going out to industry experts. Make sure that the questions are easy to interpret. Okay, we're getting a little short on time, so I'm going to breeze through these a little bit, but I'm going to pause just here for a second. This is a really important slide. This will hopefully be easier to study if you view the recording later. But these are our 4 data types. We've got nominal, ordinal, interval, and racial. Nominal data it just has a label, such as gender or marital status. There's no numbers in there. Ordinal has some sort of an order, like less likely and more likely that's an order. Interval are going to have some sort of an absolute distance between the options, such as I have 2 children versus 3 children. And then origin, our ratio data is going to have a true 0 point, such as price. Depending on how we're asking a question and what data type we have, it's going to dictate what kind of analysis we can do. We can't run a regression on nominal data, but we can on ratio data. And these are hierarchical, by the way. So ratio data is interval, ordinal, and can be nominal technically. So each of these has the components of the previous one. Nominal data just offers descriptions. Ordinal has orders. Intervals has defined distances, and ratios have origins. At the end of the day, when you've finished your survey, you need to make sure that we reevaluate whether or not the survey questions align with an objective and that we've answered all of the objectives. It's very easy, especially when multiple people are involved in providing feedback on a survey. It's really easy to say, hey, let's ask this, and let's ask this. That's a really easy way to get the survey out of control. They need to tie back to an objective. And if we determine that those questions are relevant and that we missed an objective, great, let's add it to the research plan. But we need to just be sure that there's always going to be some consistency there. And by the way, once the survey is launched, there's no turning back. So before you launch the survey, make sure you've got everything you need in there. Okay, some quick quality checking. Make sure someone internally, other than you, quality checks the survey. Pre-test it, which means you'll have other staff members take the survey, but you might even have some target audience members take the survey. These would be people you would coordinate with, and you would ask them to take the survey. I like to actually do this live over Zoom. They'll take the survey, and I'll watch them take the survey, and they'll address any issues or confusions that they have as they take it. And then when you launch it, only launch it to a soft launch, 10% of the sample, then review the data, make sure everything is looking good, fix any errors before you do a full launch. Okay, make sure all your question numbering matches what you want it to be. Make sure that there's any recoded values you need. If you are going to, say, take a Likert scale and turn that into a coded scale, you can do that after the fact, or you can do that inside the survey. Make sure you've got your quotas in place. Ensure that any skip logic, display logic, etc. is working properly. And I know this feels really basic and fundamental, but please run a spell check. Make sure that it may not need to be perfectly grammatically correct, but it does need to have proper spelling. So with that, that's all I've got for you. So again, probably not fully comprehensive, but hopefully this gives you the basics of what you need to know to make sure you're writing effective surveys, and would always be happy to help out anybody who has any questions about this as well.
Awesome. Matt, I really enjoyed your presentation. You have some great skills in presenting very clearly. Enjoyed the slides. Are you willing to share the slides with the group?
Yes, of course. Yeah, I'll send these over to you and would love for you to share them.
Yeah, so we'll send out a link to the recording and also a link to Matt's slides. Looks like we have 12 questions coming up here. I just want to throw out to the group, if there's anything you'd like to add, like it doesn't have to be a question. If you have a comment, something that you think is a best practice that you'd like to add to this presentation, just toss it out in the Q&A and we'll read through them. Let me share my screen real quick. Just a reminder here before we get to the Q&A, excuse me, of our upcoming events. You see we have a virtual workshop coming up next month, as well as a great webinar. We have an in-person workshop out in Orlando in January. And then, yeah, put on your calendars the Sawtooth Research Conference out in New Orleans. It's going to be great. If you're new to Sawtooth, we have a powerful survey platform. We do conjugate analysis. It's really good at max diff, easy to use. We have world-class support, and you can try us for free at discover.sawtoothsoftware.com. I'll also add we have consulting. If you don't want to do the survey, we can do it for you. And Dan Yardley's on the call now if you want to ask him any questions about that. With that, Matt's happy to share his information here, email, phone number, LinkedIn. Matt, do you see the Q&A section there in LinkedIn? Or sorry, in Zoom?
Yes, I do.
If you wouldn't mind reading the question so everybody can hear it and then answering it, that would be great. Dan, feel free to jump in as well. And then again, if you have any comments, just like, hey, here's the best practice that I would like to share, feel free to share your comments and we'll read those too. Take it away, Matt.
Wonderful. Okay, our first question from Alexandra. For awareness questions, could you share your opinion on the best way to collect this data? The slide presented a full scale for a full specific brand. If we have multiple brands, would you prefer using a single choice grid with brands or rows? That's a really great question. Yes, so for unaided, hopefully you'll get any additional brands in there. For aided, I use what's called a matrix question, where you have the brands listed going down the column, and then across the top, you'd have not at all aware, have heard of them, but never used them, etc. And so sort of that matrix type question. You also can break that into multiple questions where you just say, have you ever heard of Target? Next question, have you ever heard of Walmart? And go on down the line, but that does take longer, though people prefer those sorts of questions over matrix questions. Let me make sure I answered the rest of this, or would you go with multiple choice for aided, showing only the options chosen in the first question? That's another great approach, by the way. So you can use what's called piped responses, where if you have a longer list and say, hey, have you ever heard of this list of 15 options, and it's a multiple select, yeah, I've heard of these 5, then it carries those 5 to another question that says, okay, of those 5, how aware are you of them, or how familiar are you, or how engaged are you with them? Those are some really great approaches to doing that. Okay, Christina, do you have any stats or resources evidencing the drop off in engagement data quality the longer survey gets? Oh, that's a great question. I'm conscious of keeping surveys as short as possible, but clients often push for as much content as possible, and it would be great to be able to reel off some stats to help them reconsider. Love that question. I've seen stats like this over the years. The only one I remember off the top of my head is, I believe, SurveyMonkey used a lot of their internal data of like 20,000 surveys or something like that, and showed the actual drop-off rate. And that's kind of, where you get that 7 to 8 minutes or so. So I don't have an exact one, but I think SurveyMonkey had that. Of course, they've renamed themselves. I won't say because I can't remember exactly what their new name is. And the other thing I would say that I think is in the slides, but that I didn't verbalize, is if you have too many questions, you might just need to send 2 surveys. If the survey ends up being super long and the stakeholders say there's no way we can eliminate any of these, and it's like, great, we're going to cut this into 2 surveys. Might cost more money and take more time, but that's a good approach as well. I know that there might not be a right or wrong answer here, but like to hear your perspective. Sawtooth advises providing warm-up questions for CBC. Others believe that you should just jump into the task at hand, as participant attention is limited, so warm-ups are not required. Also, my professor prefers demographic type questions asked later too, as it is easier for participants to answer easier questions toward the end of the survey. I was an instructor too. So the funny thing about academics is sometimes they do know better, but sometimes they don't have the practical experience. Demographic type questions should be asked later if they can. But for purposes of quotas, often from a practical standpoint, they need to be at the beginning. If we need to get a certain number of people in a certain age group, then we're going to have to ask that question at the beginning of the survey, not the end. So that would be the only issue for that. As far as the warm-up questions, yeah, I'm a little indifferent to that. I think a warm-up question is great. It all depends on how long the survey is. If the survey is getting kind of long, I'm not an expert on that particular topic, and so I'd say it might be the first thing you could cut. But if you've got room in the survey, I don't see anything wrong with some warm-up questions. I will say that in pre-testing that I do with people, that's a really good way to see what people don't understand. And it's not uncommon for people to be a little confused on the first 1 or 2 screens for a conjoint. Now, hopefully you've had a previous screen that kind of gives them some instructions and tells them how it's going to work, but it's not uncommon that they might be a little confused. So that's not a bad thing. We have been utilizing video response questions more and more. Any guidance on those? Recording time, length, type of questions best suited for that format. I've done that a little bit, but I wouldn't be an expert on that. My only advice there is, again, it can be a great way to get more time out of a respondent because they like doing that more than they like doing some things. But just keep in mind, how are you going to utilize that information? If you're using ChatGPT or something else to try to do that, that's great. But you really want to get them in and out. So the length of the response should be really short as possible. And the type of questions best suited for that would be open-ended responses. So that would be like an unaided question, like, what brand first comes to mind when you think about athletic shoes? Or maybe a more in-depth experience question, tell us about your last experience. Again, I'm more of a fan of doing qualitative research versus large-scale qualitative research through a survey, but that's just a personal opinion. With the rise of ChatGPT, we also find that very high-quality open-ended answers may be a sign of a bot. Okay, kind of. But when you actually read a bot question response, you can tell. The question will be, like you say, too high quality. It will be, okay, so for me, one of the most innovative and wonderful experiences that I've experienced is blah blah blah. Like you can kind of tell that this wasn't a real person who wrote it. Any other suggestions on catching fake responses? So number one, a lot of times you can implement some sort of fraud detector into the survey, which is helpful for that. Hopefully, you're using good panel providers who are checking for that, reCAPTCHA scores, things like that. But at the end of the day, you might hate my answer. It's a bit of an old school answer. You should read every open response. And if you've only got one or two, it doesn't take long. If you have 1,000 open-ended responses, people are only going to type about a sentence. It'll only take you 30 minutes to read all of those. And you can usually tell if it was written by a robot or not. Great question. Data quality considerations. Can you provide some suggestions on eliminating participant data if they complete the survey too quickly? Yes. Delete anybody who takes the survey and completes it in less than 1/3 of the median time. Don't even look at their responses, just delete them. Also, delete anybody who straight lines a matrix question. This is a little bit of a hot take because some people just straight line honestly, but at least evaluate it. Look at the variance of a matrix question and see if you need to delete that. And then reading through their open-ended question. Again, make sure you've got at least one. And if you've got one good open-ended question, it looks like they wrote it well, then that one might work as well. You say don't educate, but what is where you are asking people to evaluate a new product concept? Well, that's a great point. Yes, I would correct myself on that. If it's for a product concept test or something like that, then you should tell them about your new product and what your product is like. Yes, when I say don't educate, this first came up a few years ago from a nonprofit who wanted to educate, I don't even remember what the topic was, on some sort of a social issue. And the way that they were educating it, to me, felt very biased, and it felt like it was going to influence the respondent. Number one, we usually just don't have a lot of time to educate in a survey. But number two, just make sure that whatever you're doing is not biased, and I think you'll be okay. Really good point. Gareth said there was a nice example of leading questions in the UK when Scotland were voting for independence. The wording, do you agree that Scotland should be an independent country? Good example. This was rejected as being biased in favor of a yes answer. And they said to change it to, should Scotland be an independent country, yes or no? Makes sense that the first wording leads. I love that. And what you could also have done in the first option is say, do you agree or disagree? That could have been an option. But yeah, I love it. You want the question to be as neutral as your response options are. Do you have an opinion on using positive versus negative scales? So not at all to very versus different endpoints such as very good to very bad. Okay, so you've identified a unipolar question versus a bipolar question. A unipolar question would start at 0. I'm not at all interested to going to some positive. A bipolar would go from unsatisfied to very satisfied. The difference between those depends on usually what you're asking, whether or not there's a 0 amount. So if you're asking satisfaction, you can be dissatisfied. So that would be bipolar, dissatisfied to very satisfied. Something could be very good or it could be very bad. The not at all is usually like an awareness question. You're not a negative awareness. You're just not at all aware. So unipolar versus bipolar depends on how you're what you're asking about. When there are scales, do you recommend that they always orient negative to positive? Okay. No. In fact, clients of mine often will prefer that they go positive to negative. They'll in classes you might learn about marketing research that you should actually switch it up, and that helps to see if people are paying attention. Go negative to positive, positive to negative. I don't think that I'm an expert to answer how that should be written. I think for me, I just think linearly. So to me, negative to positive makes more sense. But again, I often change that because customers ask. So I don't know the right answer, but those are some of my thoughts. What is your perspective on ranking questions? I have been using them less and less since I feel like they leave a bit of a knowledge gap. For example, what if the items they ranked 1 through 3 are actually very close in terms of importance? The ranking may suggest more of a gap than there is. Okay, this is a great question. I would use a max diff if the question is if the list of items is long enough, because max diff will provide that magnitude that you're talking about, especially if you're using an anchored max diff. So that would be my first recommendation. If you've really only got like three options, I agree with you. I don't love ranking questions for that reason. You might need to follow it up with a question like, okay, that was your ranking, but would you actually buy this, or do you actually favor this? The only problem is the alternative is to do a rating question. How much do you like this on a scale of 1 to 5? And those tend to not have very much variance. Everybody will say 5, for example. So I'm in the same boat you are. I don't use them very often. I would favor a max diff or just a rating question. But rankings sometimes have their place. Jake Lee, is this the Jake Lee that I know? If you're my buddy Jake Lee, good to talk to you. Would it make sense to have an outline of the analysis plan before the first draft of the questionnaire? Yeah, in fact, you might already know that, as you develop. So the first step is you develop the business objectives, and at that stage, you may already know some of the analysis you're going to run. So I think, if I'm not mistaken, I usually write the analysis plan after the survey, after I've written the first draft. But yeah, if you already know some of that, get it started, and maybe that will actually save you some time as you write the questionnaire. Any tips to make conjoint more mobile friendly? You know what? My only tip is that Sawtooth's been doing some awesome stuff with their Discover product. This has a little bit more to do with the software than anything. So that's my first tip. Second tip is make everything concise. Your features should be very short. Your feature levels should be very short. Make them as concise as you possibly can.
Yeah, we do accommodate for mobile on both Lighthouse Studio and Discover. You should check that out or give us a call. Matt, are you okay to go past the hour answering these questions? Is that okay?
Yeah, sorry, I've been talking so fast to try to get
No,
through all of these,
you're
but yes,
doing
I'm free.
you're doing a fantastic job. But for everybody, we'll just keep going. And if you have to leave, that's great. We will send out a recording afterwards. But we'll just keep the video rolling here.
All right.
11 more. Here we go.
The true nerds are gonna hang on a little longer. Okay, Matt, this is a great overview. Question: have you been able to watch survey testers drawn from a panel? Yes, if I understand your question, which is if we pre-test a survey and we have them take a survey live, have I ever done that from a respondent that came from a panel? If that's what you're asking, my answer is yes. I have done that, and they've worked great. I think I'm always, even till today, I'm still sort of skeptical of panel respondents, but yeah, you know what? They're, as long as it's not a bot, they're usually real people, and yeah, it's gone really great. So I have done that, and it's worked out well. Our own Dan at Sawtooth. This is a lot of great advice. Thank you. Do you have any advanced, thorough resources, books that you recommend to help us become experts in data collection and survey design? Boy, I wish I had kept better track of that, because I've gotten that question a few times. The truth is, I try to stay on top of research and survey methodology. I follow some people on LinkedIn. I do read books about the topic, and I try to just stay on top of it all the time. For those of you who don't like to eat, drink, and live survey design, I think a great book is called, I think it's just called Marketing Research, and I think the author was Malhotra was the last name. That's a really good. It goes through the entire 7-step research process, talks about every topic. That's a really good textbook if you want to read a textbook on the topic. Luis, does Matt have any thoughts about gamification in surveys? I don't think I have a lot of expertise in that, so I guess the answer is no. Paul Moon, we all come across surveys that are too long and go well beyond our desired length of interview. One option we like to use is to apply a number of split questions where only 50% see a particular question. This is a good approach for adaptive choice-based conjoint as well, as this helps lower the length of interview. Your thoughts on this approach? Love that approach, Paul. The only thing that I would add to that is making sure you've got a large enough sample size so that you kind of want to double your sample size, right? So that you've got a good enough sample, but great approach. The only downside to it is of course, if you get one respondent answering all the questions, then you've got a row of data from one respondent. And if you've broken that, then you kind of limit some of the analysis you can do on it. So that's the downside to it. Another good example I'd give is sometimes you just need another survey. There's a Marriott example where they did a conjoint study, and rather than doing one conjoint study for hotels, they did one conjoint study for the hotel room, one conjoint study for the lobby, one conjoint study for the business services section. And so I'm also just a fan of breaking out the survey into multiple surveys with new topics. You mentioned using regression. Let's say we have a series of ratings and we want to use them as predictors, but we have an option for those ratings that are something like don't know, not enough experience with this. Regression works on complete cases. How can we deal with this issue? Is this ultimately a sampling issue? Do we switch to bipolar scales with a neutral response and treat these answers as such? Do we look to some other analysis? Yeah. You've identified some good options for it. Another option is imputation. I hate imputation, which you may have identified earlier in this presentation. So you could, if they say don't know, don't have enough experience, you could give them the average number. And so that hopefully their response just kind of goes away, but it allows you to still use them in the data. So that would probably be my number one approach, but I don't like that approach. I don't like that at all. So, and again, hopefully we're sending this survey to people who will have experience, but some of our questions, that's just going to be a really appropriate answer. Switching to bipolar scales, yeah, that's a good option. So that you've got a neutral. Yeah, that would probably be my second recommendation. Anna says, what tools would you recommend for running online surveys combined with images? Well, Sawtooth can put images, and so Sawtooth is great with that. And if you just mean, like let's say you're showing a package design and you want to show multiple options of images for people to select, yeah, Sawtooth Discover is a great option for that. Ron says, what are your thoughts on sentence completion type open-ended questions, which tend to be shorter, 1 to 3 word responses? Do you believe there's enough substance in this format? What are your thoughts on sentence completion type questions, which tend to be shorter, 1 to 3 word responses? I'm not sure I exactly understand your question. If you're saying, is it okay that they only have 1 or 3 words? Is there enough substance? I think it's great as long as it fits the topic. Most of my open-ended questions actually are only supposed to be that, where I'll say, what are a few words or adjectives you would use to describe this brand? Or, when you think of this brand, what do you think of? And sometimes I'll actually say, please describe, a sentence or two of your experiences. So apologies, Ron, if I don't fully understand your question, but yeah, if you've just got a few words in there, as long as it matches your question, that's great. If your question is, hey, tell us about your experiences, and it's 1 to 3 words, that might be a data quality issue of someone who's not reading the question, who's not interested in replying to your question, and you might want to flag that. Working with survey participant provider company. Can you talk about best practices when working with these companies? What requirements should I think about so that expectations are met? Yes, and I always try to kind of avoid giving out brands. If you want to contact me, I can give you some recommended brands. I just don't want to plug anything per se in a public format. But number one, find a good company that's got a good reputation. Hopefully you've heard about them or asked recommendation from someone else who's done this. Incentive amounts is really important. Some you can go with some people who will have incentives that are ridiculously low. They'll pay a few cents for a respondent. You're not going to get good data quality from that. So you need to get someone who's paying a high enough incentive, oddly enough. But if the incentive is too high, that's also a problem, because then you might get people who are just taking the survey for the incentive. So there's this interesting balance. You want to get panel providers who are going to be giving a decent sized incentive. That would be the one thing that I would say. But then, yeah, just look for recommendations, because you need a company that has good fraudulent detection, that has bot detection, that are weeding a lot of that stuff out before you ever get it. I don't love the do-it-yourself type of sample providing. I feel like you're better off talking with someone For those who didn't know, Sawtooth Software offers panel services, sample provider services. So you can talk to Justin about getting in touch. I think Lee might be the one at Sawtooth who's over that. So they can help with that as well. You just want some reputable companies. What is your opinion on using even or odd number of items in a scale? So should there be a neutral center point on bipolar scales? Really good. You'll get annoyed hearing me say this, but it depends on your objective. I'm normally a fan of not having a neutral for a bipolar question in particular. Like if you're using a bipolar question for a segmentation study, for example, do not have a neutral. Force them into one or the other. A lot of people will disagree with me on that, and they think that there should be a neutral. So I would call that more of a personal preference. I don't like having a neutral in some cases, but if you're asking how satisfied you are, I think that makes sense to have a neutral option. For me, it's more, I think, for things like clustering. If your analysis is going to really require you to cluster or segment people based on that option, I really want to have some defined answers from them. Our clients want to use MaxDiff to do marketing messaging testing, see which message resonates with the respondents most. But a lot of times they are long statements. Is there a better way to do messaging tests? MaxDiff is a great way to do message testing if the message is short enough. And you're right, if it gets too long, it might make for an awkward experience. So, I might program it and try it because I do think that is a great approach if it's not too long. But otherwise, I often just do the traditional approach, and I'll start with each individual message. I alluded to this earlier with regard to randomizing blocks or pages, where let's say you have 5 questions for one message. How much do you like this message? What do you, a few other questions about it. Does it resonate with you? Would it help you take action? And then you go to another question. And then after they've done all of that, the final question is showing them all 4 messages and saying, okay, now tell me which is your favorite, or that could be a ranking question as well.
Hey, Matt, we got a few more, almost done. You're doing great. I'm just like laughing here. You still have 67 people hanging on, afterwards. So you're doing a great job hitting home run here. Awesome.
Wonderful. Thanks, Justin.
Looks
Really, really
like,
great questions, by the way. Holy cow, this is great.
yeah, looks like Christian is jumping in again to clarify what he was talking about.
People who eat fast food are. Oh, I hear you. Yeah, no, I think that's great. I think that's a super great approach because you only need one comment there. So and yeah, then ultimately I would call that you're looking for an adjective, most likely an adjective that describes a particular thing. This could be for a brand. How would you describe this brand? This brand is blank. I think that's totally okay. Now, I would say that the open-ended response would give you more info, but the way that you've written it there would be faster, and so it'd be a better experience for the respondent. So I see pros and cons, but I really like it. And thank you, anonymous attendee, for your great session comment.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Matt. Really appreciate it. This is all going to be recorded, so we'll be able to watch it again. And Matt's offered to share his slides, so we'll share those as well. Thanks
Yeah,
again. Everybody go ahead, Matt.
and feel free to reach out if you have any questions. There's my email address and my phone number. Would be happy to just connect with you and get to know you.
Great. Everybody have a great day, and we'll see you on our next webinar. See you guys. Bye.